All right, when I say English romantic poets, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably dusty old books, right? Maybe a boring classroom lecture? Well, I want you to just throw all that out. Because these guys, they were the original rebels. I'm talking rock stars of their time. They lived these wild, scandalous lives, got into huge literary fights, and totally flipped the script on how we think about art, nature, and even ourselves. So let's dive in and figure out what made them such revolutionary.
And yeah, I know what you might be thinking. What on earth do a bunch of dead poets have to do with rock and roll? Well, it's a great question. And the answer is pretty much everything. That whole spirit of rebellion, the obsession with raw, intense emotion, the idea of the artist as this tortured, visionary genius, it all starts right here. The Romantics basically handed us the blueprint for every counterculture movement that came after them for the next 200 years.
Okay, so to really get the Romantics, you have to get the world they were living in. I mean, they weren't just writing poetry in some quiet, peaceful bubble. No way. They were forged in an absolute firestorm of political chaos and social change.
Just look at this timeline. It tells you everything you need to know. The whole thing kicks off in 1789 with the French Revolution, an event that just lit this spark of liberty and equality all across Europe. Then, boom, 1798, you get the literary revolution with the publication of lyrical ballads. And the whole period is capped off by events like the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, a really brutal government crackdown on protesters that was a stark reminder that the fight for freedom was nowhere near over. So you have this incredibly turbulent, violent, and politically charged world, which, it turns out, is the perfect breeding ground for revolutionary art.
And this is so crucial to understand. Romanticism wasn't just a new idea. It was a full-blown, passionate rebellion against the era that came right before it, the Enlightenment. Think of it this way. The Enlightenment was all about the head, reason, order, logic, what's best for society as a whole. The Romantics came along and said, no, it's all about the heart. They championed raw emotion, the power of nature, and the untamed wilderness of the individual's imagination. It was a massive, seismic shift.
But here's where it gets really interesting. You might think the Romantics were all on the same team, right? One big, happy family of poets? Not even close. They were actually split into these fiercely competitive groups, or schools, who were constantly taking shots at each other in magazines and reviews. Each one was absolutely convinced that they had the one true vision for where poetry should go next.
And this gives us a great little breakdown of the main players. First up, you've got the Lake School. These were the OGs, the first generation, guys like Wordsworth and Coleridge living up in the beautiful Lake District. Their whole thing was finding deep spiritual truth in nature and the lives of everyday country folk. Then, you got the Cockney School down in London. Now that was actually an insult, a snooty name given to poets like John Keats because they weren't born into the upper class and critics mocked them for it. And finally, the one and only Satanic School, led by the ridiculously scandalous Lord Byron and his friend Percy Shelley. These guys basically invented the dark, brooding, rebellious anti-hero.
And this idea from Wordsworth, you have to understand how radical this was at the time. Before him, poetry was supposed to be this very formal thing filled with fancy, artificial language that only the highly educated could really get. Wordsworth comes along and says, no, the most profound truths are in the simple language that real people actually speak. Farmers, shepherds. He wanted to blow the doors open and make poetry for everyone, not just a tiny elite.
Then you've got Keats, from that group the critics sneered at, the Cockney School. And his point is a little different, but just as radical. He's saying poetry isn't something you can just force with your intellect. It has to be organic, something that flows out of you as naturally as leaves growing on a tree. It's all about that gut feeling, that intuitive spark of imagination. It's that authenticity that was so important to him.
Oh, and this just perfectly captures the whole vibe of the Satanic School. This wasn't some stuffy literary review, by the way. This was an actual quote from one of Lord Byron's ex-lovers describing him. And he loved it. He and his friends basically built their entire brand around this image of the Byronic hero, this brilliant but moody, morally questionable outcast who played by his own rules. Seriously, almost every dark, complicated anti-hero you've ever rooted for in a movie or a book, their great-great-great-grandfather is right here.
So, okay, they were rivals, for sure, but for all their fighting, there were a few huge ideas that they all shared. These core concepts are what really held the whole movement together.
First up is this idea of the sublime. And this isn't just, oh, that's a pretty sunset. No, the sublime is that gut punch feeling of being completely overwhelmed by the power and sheer scale of nature. It's that mix of awe and honestly a little bit of terror you feel
when you're standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon or watching a massive thunderstorm roll in. You feel tiny but also connected to something immense. For them, that was a spiritual experience, something you found out in the wild, not inside a church.
Okay, next up is a phrase I'm sure you've heard before, coined by Coleridge himself, the willing suspension of disbelief. Think of it as a deal, a pact that the poet makes with you, the reader. They're saying, look, I'm about to tell you a story with ghosts and ancient curses and all sorts of supernatural stuff. To really enjoy it, you just have to agree to put your skepticism on a shelf for a little while and let your imagination run wild. It's the price of admission to their fantastic worlds.
Now, this next one from Keats is a little more brainy, but it is pure 100% romanticism. He called it negative capability. And what he meant was the ability, especially for an artist, to just be okay with uncertainty and mystery. It's about not having that nagging need to find a logical, tidy explanation for everything. It's the power of being comfortable in the gray areas, of accepting that some of the most beautiful things in life can't, and maybe even shouldn't, be explained away by cold, hard reason.
So you might be wondering, how did they actually turn all these big ideas into poems? Well, Wordsworth actually gave us his recipe for creativity. He said it starts with step 1, observation. You have this powerful, spontaneous, emotional experience out in nature. But here's the key. You don't write the poem right then and there. Step 2 is recollection. Later, when you're calm, you think back on that feeling. Then step 3, you filter it. You sort of distill that personal memory down to its core universal truth. And only then, in step 4, do you compose the poem, trying to bottle up that emotion so the reader can feel it too. It's a genius process for turning a single moment into a piece of universal art.
Okay, so after all this, you might be asking, why should I care about any of this today? And the answer is because their ideas are everywhere. They've become so baked into how we think about the world that we don't even notice them anymore. Their revolution wasn't a flash in the pan, it was one that truly stuck.
I mean, just think about it for a second. That idea we have of the artist as some kind of special, visionary genius, that's totally romantic. The idea that your own personal feelings, your inner world, are a worthy subject for a song or a painting, yep, that's romantic too. The impulse to go hiking to clear your head and find some kind of spiritual peace, pure romanticism. And yeah, every time you root for that dark, brooding rebel in a TV show, you're falling for the Byronic hero all over again. Ultimately, what they really gave us is the belief that the #1 job of art is self-expression.
So let's leave it with maybe the most famous lines from the entire Romantic movement, written by John Keats. It's a line that cuts through all the complicated philosophy and just gives you this simple, beautiful equation that the deepest truth we can ever grasp is found in beauty. For the Romantics, it didn't matter if that beauty was in a powerful feeling, a stunning landscape, or just one perfect line of poetry. That search for truth through beauty, well, that was the whole point.